Hello! It is not the end of the world. It is actually time to talk more about research, and I know you're excited about that. So we are going to talk a little bit more about our ways of knowing. So in one of the videos, I ended the video with the 3 ways of knowing, which are presented to you in chapter 2. And really what these ways of knowings are something we call paradigms. And a paradigm is a different perspective or lens of different views or different ways of doing things. Many people have different paradigms about how they think or how they do something. I live in a paradigm of chaos, and I love it. I'm very messy. If you were to see my desk right now, you might be surprised. I view the world much better in chaos. Now, other people can't even imagine functioning like that. Maybe they view and operate in a world of order, even so much order that they might have an anal retentive disorder, and they have to line all their forks up perfectly in a drawer. So all a paradigm is a different way of looking at things. And you're going to be introduced today and in 300 and in your capstone class to a lot of different paradigms. They're ways academic scholars think about things or approach the world. So don't overthink them or get too confused. Remember, it's just a different perspective. I have a perspective about how I think Christmas should be celebrated. You may not even celebrate Christmas, which is a whole nother paradigm. So it's just different ways of looking at things. For our purposes in this class, we are going to talk about the different ways we do research, not the different ways we think about things theoretically. That's 300, okay? But we're going to talk in here about the actual research process and the way we go through doing research in the academic world. And so for our purposes in this class, there are 3 methodological or methods for doing research. We have quantitative social science, interpretation, and criticism. There are only 3 for us. Now you're going to have 4 theoretical ways of knowing in 300. You will end up seeing a picture close to this in your 300 text. This is theoretical ways of looking at things, but I can still show you how this fits in to our ways of doing research. Some of the time we do research that is very objective. Other times we do research that's much more subjective. So let's first start with the notion of what is objective versus subjective. Objective is when we try to take all biases out of any kind of experiment or study we're doing. We want to have a very objective, non-biased viewpoint. And that's very difficult to do, but in science we certainly do try to do that through experiments and having control groups and experiments and trying to keep personal stories and biases out of it. The subjective side, subjective means just that. My study comes from a personal opinion or personal viewpoint. It's very subjective. So I'll give you a really good example. Sometimes teachers say, oh, teachers are supposed to be very objective with their students. And I say, that's crap. We're subjective. And to some degree, I think it's true. We're very subjective. We definitely, put our own personal biases and opinions probably into teaching where we shouldn't. It's very difficult to be truly objective about something and say you have a neutral stance. So that's the difference between the objective and subjective. Now let's talk about the difference between regulation and radical change. Regulation implies that whatever activity is happening is regulated in some way. There are certain rules. So there are actually certain rules in dodgeball, if you had to play that when you were growing up, which you probably didn't, but there's certain rules and we have to follow those. Radical change says, let's just have chaos. It's a free-for-all. Here's a bunch of dodgeballs, go after each other. That's kind of the radical change. It's much more subjective as well as less regulated. So when we look at research and our 3 methodological ways of knowing, we can kind of start to make sense of this graph. So I want you to look at the functionalist box there. It is objective and regulated. Which paradigm do you think that that matches with? Ding, ding, ding. It's quantitative social science because it is experiments, surveys, very objective. We are not interviewing people. We are trying to get a very objective answer, and it's well regulated by certain steps and procedures in experimental protocol that we have to follow. So let's move over to interpretive. Now guys, you can't get this one wrong. Interpretive is still regulated. There's still certain protocol you have to follow, but it is much more subjective research. So here's why I said you can't get this wrong. Which one do you think interpretive is? It's interpretation. This one actually carries the same name. When we talk about interpretive ways of doing research, we're going to talk about this being ethnography and case studies where we interview and we talk to people. And we still have certain regulations and guidelines and protocols that we follow, so it is regulated, but we're getting someone's personal opinion. So this is really, I like to say another way to look at it is this might be that I gave a class a survey and got an objective average on what you think about distance learning. But what if I interviewed 10 people and got their opinion about distance learning? They're still both valuable pieces of information. They're just different ways of getting it, different paradigms. All right, so let's go up here to these two. You can guess right away that this one, radical structuralist, is more objective. Okay, so I'm not getting personal opinion, but it's also looking at a lot of change and things and events that have happened. These two boxes, and then radical humanist, much more subjective, a lot more personal opinion, and still looking at social change. Okay, so both of these boxes go to which type of methodological way of knowing? It's this one. It's this one. Criticism. That's the last one. And for our purposes, criticism covers both of these boxes because essentially how a radical humanist would approach research and a radical structuralist would approach research is still through the same criticism mechanism. Just one is more objective and one is more subjective. And I'd like you to think of, whoops, we're not there yet, that radical change one as looking at social justice and change and values in society. That's what criticism does. So we're going to go through each of the three ways of knowing and talk a little bit about what that entails in terms of research. So we're going to skip this one for now. I'm going to come back to that. But let's talk about the key points of the scientific method or social science or functionalism. In the communication discipline, we're crazy. We have like 20 words that all mean the same thing. So don't get tripped up. It is functionalism. It is objective. It is scientific method. It's also what we're going to call in a few moments quantitative. Okay, that all falls under one thing, the scientific method. Scientific method is a paradigm where we try to be very objective. We don't want to insert personal biases at all. It is very precise and systematic. So when we do an experiment, I mentioned earlier, we have something we call a control group, and then we have maybe a group who actually participated. You may have heard of this from a placebo effect. So say they actually did this with masks recently. They did a study with masks and people talking, and they used ultralights to see how many particles were coming out. And so, of course, they had many different groups with different types of masks on to try to measure how many particles were coming through in the masks. Very systematic, very precise. And sometimes, like I just said with the masks, it's repetitive. Most scientific experiments should be able to be recreated or repeated. So how many of you saw the Coca-Cola bottle rockets that they made with, oh dang, what was that terrible candy? You put it in there, Mentos, and it explodes. That's a very scientific experiment. And of course, we can all follow the directions and repeat it and make the same thing happen. So that is scientific method. It is objective, it is regulated, and it helps us then to generalize to a larger population. So if I survey 800 students at SDSU and ask them how they feel about distance learning, I can come up with an average number. And out of that number, I can say, I make a generalization and say, 60% of students at SDSU love distance learning. Okay, so very precise, functionalist, quantitative. We're usually doing experiments and survey research. That's the scientific method. Interpretation, much different. We're over on the other side now. This is subjective. That means it's coming from my point of view. My personal feelings and how I interpret things are now a part of the research. So with this type of research, again, it's subjective. It's still regulated. We still have certain protocol that we're looking for and certain things that we want to understand. But the meanings are constructed by the human beings, not by data, not by statistics. This is obviously a lot of scholars in communication like to do research and interpretation because it's so heavily communication interaction based. Humans engage with their world. The way we make sense of it allows us to then know something. I have a group in my other class, they want to research how people feel about art and propaganda. So they're going to interview different people and talk to them about what meaning they get from certain art forms. This is very subjective because what I may think of a piece of art may not be what you think of as, with the same piece of art. I used to have that as a kid, modern art. I would be like, it's just a line down the page. How can you call that art? And other people would be like, it's beautiful. Those are different, perspectives, but that's still meaningful information. So interpretation is what we're going to call a qualitative or very interviews. It's a very subjective way of getting information, but we say people's stories are still very valid and we can learn from them. The last way we do research is criticism. Now, remember I said it fits both those boxes because essentially while they are still two different ways of looking at things, we basically research those two paradigms the same way. We research those two paradigms through criticism. It is also subjective. Now, that means personal opinion. You're going to insert your own biases or what you think based on history, culture, and society. So criticism is research that's written typically about different artifacts. You're going to hear me use the word artifacts a lot. An artifact is something that generally already exists or already happened. You are not dealing with human subjects here. You're not talking to people. You're not surveying people. You're looking at something that already exists. So here, I'm just going to pull this off my desk. Maybe you can see it. What is this? It's a symbol. And I can actually write a critique about what this symbol might say about society and our values. Just like I could do that as well with the flag or a speech. If a speech is given, I can analyze that speech to see what it says about our society, history, and any kind of philosophical movement or political movement. There's been a lot of criticism being written about, and not criticism like I'm critiquing, but research being written about the effects of Black Lives Matter. And so people are looking at artifacts and speeches and documents to kind of come to a conclusion about where is our society right now with race. And it's fascinating. So criticism is research about things that have already happened or already exist. You are not dealing with people here, folks. I want to make that clear. Those are the three. So we have one that's very objective, dealing with numbers, science, experiments, regulated. Another type of research we call interpretation, which deals with more subjective information, interviews, stories, case studies. And then we have criticism. This is the third type of research where we write papers about artifacts and events that have already happened, and we look at the social impact on society, history, and etc. through those artifacts' viewpoint. All right, I'm going to go back to one more, not to try to confuse you. This is way ahead. This is what you're going to see when you get to capstone. But I want you to once again see it's really all the same as this graph. Everything falls in the same place. It's just changed around here. Your foundational empirical up there, guess what? That's functionalism. That is our quantitative social science. Okay? It's structured, it's empirical, it's regulated. Okay? Now over on the reflective side, we have what we would call more subjective. So our reflective empirical is interpretation. And they have up there ethnography and performance studies, and we're going to talk about that. And the two squares on the bottom both represent your radical humanist and structural humanist viewpoints. And we do those two paradigms we approach with research through the criticism paradigm. So you don't have to know this graph. You don't even really have to know this one, although you will for 300. I want you to know for our purposes that there are three paradigms or ways of doing research. Remember, there are more for looking at things, but there's really only three ways we do the research on all the different paradigms or viewpoints we have. Quantitative social science, interpretation, and criticism. That's what we're dealing with, folks. Okay, hold on. Part 2 is coming up. All right, you ready for part 2? Part 2 is going to give you, yet again, 2 more words to differentiate between the different ways of doing research. So I said we have social science, interpretation, and criticism. One of the ways that we differentiate between the three are qualitative versus quantitative, and criticism we're going to call theoretical, because it's almost always theoretical because we're theorizing about things or artifacts that already exist or have happened. Remember, we're not using actual participants that we talk or survey to. So quantitative belongs with social science. Qualitative research is interpretation, and theoretical pieces belong to criticism. So let's take a moment to make sure we can differentiate quantitative from qualitative data. So let's start with quantitative studies. Again, quantitative studies fall under the functionalist social scientific approach. We are usually dealing with larger numbers, numerical data, high numbers. If you see a study that surveyed 543 people, it's probably a quantitative study right off the bat, just from the high number you see. It's, again, generalizable to a large sample. Usually it can be conducted with surveys or questionnaires. We can also do that with experiments where we set up, again, different groups that we're going to look at. Probably one of the more famous experiments that was done in social science that you may have heard of or will hear about in 300 is the Milgram study, which was where they wanted to see if people would shock people and continue to keep shocking them past the point of hurting them. That's an experimental study. There were not supposed to be any biases. We test hypotheses or research questions and investigate relationships. These are all quantitative studies. Big numbers, large samples, surveys, questionnaires, experiments. This is social science. So now I will tell you right now, I will put my bias in. I am a quantitative researcher. I feel like if you can understand statistics and you know how to deal with large samples and data sets, that it's a valuable skill, especially in higher ed and a lot of other professions. A lot of professions now are about collecting what we call big data and working with numbers and being able to generalize about what's going on in the world. So that is quantitative, okay? I am not going to go through the types of quantitative design right now, but again, it usually deals with different statistical tests that we are actually going to learn. We'll be talking about experimental research, correlational research, different types of statistical tests that you can do, like t-tests and regression. So when we get into the very quantitative social science part of this course, we'll be learning all of those designs. Some of the advantages, why do quantitative research? Well, it implies a certain amount of rigor. We know the steps by which it is judged. Think back to that first day when I showed you the Jon Stewart video. Remember, it's peer-reviewed. They have to go through certain steps. This is part of why even finding a vaccine right now is taking so long. The FDA has to approve things step by step. We just don't say, oh, here, this works, go for it. We have to have a very rigorous vetting process for our research. It uses a lot of statistics. We like statistics because then we can compare. So what's interesting to me right now is we've got 13 outbreaks of COVID on our campus. How many other campuses have had similar numeric outbreaks, and what has happened to those campuses? We can now start comparing across different venues. You cannot do that in qualitative research because I can't compare my experience to your experience. Here we can. If we have statistics, we can actually make comparisons. So we like that. That's an advantage. And we can make inferences about the larger population. We can actually make conclusions about what's going on in the larger world. So if most of the colleges that went back in person are now folding and going fully online, let's say 80%, what do you think we can predict? I'm already predicting it, that the few students we do have on campus will probably end up going home before the semester is over. So right here, you heard it, Nostradamus predicting that we will end up closing campus. Just based off the data, the numbers I've seen from other places, that would be my guess. All right, so that's quantitative research, numbers, experiments, surveys. Qualitative. Remember I said qualitative studies are interpretation, essentially. I've even called them interviews. I've said it's narrative data, it's stories, it's people's personal point of views. And again, remember, this data is very helpful to us. If I did research where I interviewed five people from another country about their attitudes about race, which I would love to do right now, it's a hot topic, then we would have their 5 viewpoints or their 5 experiences about how they talk about race in their culture. And that would just be fascinating. So it's a collection of narrative data or stories. It usually happens in what we say is a natural setting. You still interview someone, but again, there's still certain protocol. We observe people and look at them. I'm not teaching it right now, but I have taught nonverbal for many semesters, and I actually have my students do observational studies where they go out and they watch, say, mothers and fathers at play with their children, and who engages in more touching with their children, and who, you might talk to them and ask them about the play of the children. This exclusively uses interviews and document collection. And again, the meaning is constructed through the people you're talking to instead of numbers. Oftentimes in qualitative or interpretive studies, a case study, just talking to one person, is considered research or data. All right, there are different types of qualitative designs, just like there are different quantitative designs. So we have case studies, ethnography, and we'll talk a little bit about content analysis as well. We will be learning the different qualitative or interpretive designs and how to do research. Some advantages of qualitative. Just like quantitative has advantages, so does qualitative. We're able to observe phenomenon that some people might not be able to. So this is really fascinating because as a qualitative researcher, if I get access to a group or to a place where other people might not be able to see what's going on or talk to people, I have a group in my class that wants to research criminals. those who are incarcerated, essentially. I like saying it that way better than just saying criminals. But people who are incarcerated, and talk to them about their experiences. I don't know anything about that. That would be fascinating, because do I have every day the chance to go talk to people about their experiences in jail? No. So that could bring light or information to me that I don't know. So we like that, because a lot of times qualitative researchers are able to get interviews from people who have experiences that we don't know about or can't get those experiences. It also provides a way for those who cannot or will not speak for themselves. So we might not hear a whole lot about survivors of the Me Too movement. Now, of course, the Me Too movement gave it a lot more voice, but they maybe weren't going to speak up, but now are. And we're seeing a wow, this is a much bigger issue. And now we have people who can speak for others. We realize what's happened. And finally, qualitative research can be a great supplement to quantitative research. You can do both at the same time. So oftentimes I've done a survey and then followed it up with interviews as well. So we call it a mixed methods study. Now we've got one more kind of research out there, and that is criticism. Remember, criticism doesn't have a sample. It doesn't have people. So we're looking at a piece that analyzes something that has already happened. So I'm going to walk you through a little quiz here. You guys ready? All right, boom. Here's an abstract from a real communication article. Before you go crazy, let's see if we can find any key words that might help us tell us if it's quantitative, qualitative, or C, critical. So quantitative, we're looking for large numbers, and we want to know that they surveyed or did an experiment. Qualitative, we're probably looking at smaller numbers, interviews, case studies. And critical, we're looking that they're talking about something that's already happened. So if we go through and start reading this, grounded theory analysis was applied to interviews. Ding, ding, ding. That should be a red flag right there. Interviews with 25. 25 is considered a low number. Okay, actually, I would say 25 is quite a bit for a qualitative study. So, what do you think this one is? Ha ha ha. This study is qualitative, and I didn't even have to go too far. I saw the word interviews, I saw the number 25, which is low, and I could easily identify this as a qualitative study. Don't get lost in all the words. Look for the keywords that you need. Okay, next one. I got to figure this out. It's a two-part study, okay, working with adults. Through analysis of organizational communication articles, identified 343 communication behaviors. Okay, still not really sure what this is. Using an online survey. I have my first clue. I've got a survey here I'm working with. How many people were surveyed? 126. That's a big number. So with the word survey and 126, guess what? I can safely go ahead and pick that this study is quantitative. Let's try another one in case you're still struggling. This project looked at one's intentions to register as an organ donor, and it was based on a survey, data collected from 306 undergraduate students. Okay, do I need to read any further? I've got a survey. I've got 306 undergraduate students. What can I safely say this type of research is? It is quantitative. Quantitative. Let's keep going. This one's about romantic relationships. Helpful teasing. This study examines reports of hurtful teasing and nonverbal immediacy in relationship satisfaction. Participants, N equal 205. Bing, bing, bing. Here's my first clue. That's a pretty high number, so I'm leaning quantitative right now. Recalled and reported. Now here's an interesting one because they reported it. And it doesn't actually say a survey or a questionnaire, but they reported this on a questionnaire. It doesn't tell you that, but you have to make that leap or that assumption based on the number. No person in their right mind would interview 205 people. So I know from reported and the number that this is most likely a quantitative research study. Hopefully you see that. I wanted to go to this one. In 2004, so we're dealing with something in the past that's already happened. So this should be another red flag for you. Sarah Brockman declared, "We worship a mighty God in the blue states. Candidates attempted to provide Republicans religious, invoking God as an attempt at apologia." So what this analyzes, this study analyzes the religious rhetoric of the 2004 and 2008 Democratic presidential candidates in order to look at religious matters on a more global level in the parties. Which one do you think this one is? All we're doing is analyzing and looking at these speeches to see what we can draw about religious issues in each of the parties. It's critical. This is a critical. There's no sample. We're using something that already exists to try to look at the state of religion, the bigger picture, the social justice element, the state of religion in the Republican and Democratic parties. So it is critical. All right. Well, that is a lot to take in. But the basic things you want to walk away with is, while there are many different paradigms out there, philosophical, theoretical, cultural, in the communication discipline and in the ways we do research, there are three paradigms for doing research: social science or quantitative, interpretive or qualitative, and criticism or critical, theoretical data. So that's what I hope to get across. We will be taking from here on out in this course, each one in its own section. So we're going to first dive into social science, and we're going to learn all about how to do quantitative research and social science research. Then we'll dive into the qualitative interpretive paradigm and learn about case studies and interviews and ethnography. And then finally, we'll finish up this class with examining how to do research in the critical paradigm, how we look and choose artifacts to make political and social implications for society about values and issues. All right? So I'm hoping that's crystal clear. What's going to happen is we'll come back on Wednesday and we'll walk through and review a little bit of this and make sure you've got a grasp, especially on the qualitative versus quantitative and critical. All right, guys, that's all for me. Have a very good weekend, and we will see you next week.